This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On July the 5th, the Museum of the RCMI hosted a launch by Canadian author and historian Phil Halton of his new book, Blood Washing Blood, Afghanistan's 100-Year War. He is joined by Afghanistan veteran Lieutenant Colonel Scott Moody, commanding officer of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada in Toronto.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our RCMI Museum Book Launch webinar. Whether you're an RCMI member, a guest, or a virtual newcomer, we're happy to have you and welcome to today's program. My name is Ryan Goldsworthy. I'm the museum director and the curator of the RCMI Museum. And I'm also the organizer and your host for today's webinar. So once again, I'm of course not hosting from the RCMI, which remains closed due to the pandemic, but I'm here in my private office in Toronto and really looking forward to our exciting lineup of panelists today. So for today's webinar, I'll be hosting veteran and author Phil Halton for the launch of his new book, Blood Washing Blood, Afghanistan's 100-Year War. So Blood Washing Blood is now available online for purchase from Dundurn Press. Dundurn is actually a local publisher here in Toronto, really great. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge them for continuing to publish these important volumes on military history. Some of Dundurn's past volumes, which I would recommend in addition to this one by Phil Halton, would include the Vimy Foundation's They Fought in Color, Jack Granatstein's Battle Lines, and Fred Gaffin's Cross-Border Warriors. There's a lot of great volumes from across Canadian and world military history. So in addition to Phil, today we're also going to be hearing from the current CEO of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, and Afghanistan veteran, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Moody. So Scott will provide us with some excellent insight from his lived experience as an introduction to the subject matter in just a few minutes. Of course, our virtual format today, which is a consequence of the said pandemic, it's also provided us with an opportunity to more widely reach audiences, such as many of you here today. The RCMI does have a great physical and historic location downtown Toronto. It's at University in Dundas. I'm sure most of you know this. But for those who have been unable to visit us in person in the past, but perhaps always wanted to, this is a great format to welcome you in. So once again, I say thank you for joining us. We also encourage any questions that you may have for Phil, Scott, or myself. So please submit them via text in the chat box of the webinar, the Q&A, and I'll gather them at the end of the session and I'll direct them to one of our panelists. So obviously for our purposes today, all of our attendees' mics and the video will be turned off for the remainder of the session. So before I introduce Scott and then Phil for their parts, I also just want to say a few words on our world-class museum collection and on a couple of upcoming developments which you may be interested in. So I'm sure that many of our audience members are quite familiar with our current displays and the highlights, but I would like to continue to emphasize some of the facts and the standouts of Toronto's largest military history museum. So at the RCMI, we actually manage a collection of over 12,000 artifacts and 6 floors of display space with sprawling exhibitions throughout the Institute. We also possess the largest private library of military history in Canada, which is an excellent resource for educators, students, and for anyone of interest. So really quick here, throughout our 131-year history, we were founded in 1890. Many of Canada's most notable veterans, servicemen and women, and public and private leadership, including every Governor General since 1890, have been closely affiliated with the RCMI. Among the many veterans to have held membership over the years, all Canadian Victoria Cross winners have been members of the Institute. And this includes a hand-signed portrait from Billy Bishop that we have that was actually given to the Institute during his lifetime. So our museum collection has benefited from our relationship to so many distinguished members and their families. as much of our collection has come in through us from in-kind donations. Some of the highlights include the cockpit seat, the wingtip, and a strip of the fuselage from the Red Baron's triplane. We have a Sopwith propeller from Captain Roy Brown's aircraft. And we even have on display the Victoria Cross and medal set of Major Frederick Tilston of the Second World War. We have every Canadian military firearm used from 1855 to the present. We have the largest and most complete Canadian collection of First and Second World War uniforms. And we have one of the finest military art portfolios in Canada. With more specific connection to this afternoon's theme, over the past several years, the RCMI Museum has taken further and much more purposeful strides to better represent and to commemorate Canada's modern military. So since 2018, we have been actively acquiring a number of high-profile uniforms and their additional militaria. So just a few of these recent acquisitions include, which are worth highlighting. We have, just since 2018, as I mentioned, acquired Lieutenant General Paul Winnick's uniform of the Canadian Army. We acquired Vice Admiral Mark Norman's uniform of the Royal Canadian Navy. And we also had Lieutenant General Mike Hood's uniform of the Royal Canadian Air Force. So I'd also like to acknowledge the efforts of our current president, Mike Hoare, for his role in securing these uniforms for our collection. We actually plan to unveil a modern Lieutenant General display at the RCMI in the near future. Display perhaps unlike any in Canada at this time. So it's a very special collection that we've been working on. So in 2019, we also installed a dedicated gallery of over 30 hand-selected photographs to Canada's war in Afghanistan. These photographs represent the diverse roles and the mission undertaken by our armed forces from 2002 through to 2014. Moreover, as a part of our Canadian Women at War gallery, unveiled by the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario in 2019, we have on display the uniform and the military of Afghanistan veteran Jenny Carignan, who is currently Canada's highest ranking female officer. So lastly, and looking ahead, we have a couple of museum items to promote for your interest. We will also be hosting our marquee event of the year, the annual Military History Symposium, on Saturday, November the 6th. We finally have a firm date for this. And I've assembled another exciting and engaging roster of speakers for that event. So please stay tuned. Additionally, we will be launching our long-awaited permanent First World War gallery at the RCMI in a few short months from now. This gallery, which is perhaps the most ambitious installation in my time at RCMI, will be unveiled and live streamed later this year. So this event today, as well as our recent collaboration with the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association, will be available on our RCMI YouTube channel, RCMI Toronto, if you want to check it out. So as always, we greatly appreciate your continued support of the museum and for our initiatives. If you have any questions or possible donations for the museum, you can contact me anytime at ryan.goldsworthy@rcmi.org. All the contact is on our website. So this brings me to Blood Washing Blood. So Phil Halton, the author, summarizes his book as a clear-eyed view of the conflict in Afghanistan and its century-deep roots. Phil contends that the 100-year war began not from the aftermath of 9/11, but rather in February 1919, in the aftermath of the First World War and the social reforms of Amanullah Amir. This protracted war has continued from 1919 through to the recent war in Afghanistan in the 21st century. This, of course, includes Canada's part as our nation's longest war. Phil argues further that the length of the conflict in Afghanistan is a result of the Western powers' continual failure to recognize that legitimate grievances are driving the local population to turn to insurgency. The issues that local Afghans are willing to fight for have deep roots, forming a 100-year-long social conflict over questions of  modernity, and centralized power. The issues which are commonly cited as the causes for war, including global jihadism, terrorism, rampant tribalism, and the narcotics trade, are rather the consequences of the war and not the causes. Phil offers some faint hope for the future, but he concludes that the solution to the 100-year conflict is to objectively review and analyze what is truly perpetuating it from the local level and up. Today's topic continues to be timely, especially with the ongoing withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan in 2021. And I ask, what will be the immediate and long-term implications for that region and for the legacy of Canada's longest war? So before I let Phil speak on his part, I'd like to now introduce our first panelist for today's session, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Moody. As mentioned, Scott is the commanding officer of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. He joined Canada's Armed Forces in 1992 as an infantryman and a commissioned from the rank of warrant officer in 2009. Scott has served in 2 operational deployments. The first in 1997 was with the Royal Canadian Regiment as a part of Operation Palladium in Bosnia Herzegovina. And his second deployment from August 2008 to May 2009, he served as a part of Operation Athena in Kandahar, Afghanistan. Operation Athena, of course, was Canada's contribution of peace support and combat forces to the International Security Assistance Force. So from 2009 to 2012, Scott was employed as the security advisor for the Arghan Dab Irrigation and Rehabilitation Project, also in Kandahar. During the same time in Kandahar, Scott managed a security management team and an operations center, and this center was responsible for the daily operations and the security of those working on the rehabilitation project. Scott, I turn the attention over to you.
Hi, thanks very much. It's great honor and privilege to be here speaking today. I just want to start off by congratulating Phil on the completion of his book, and I know it's been out for some time now, but once again, it's quite the feat, and the topic I know is deep, and I'm sure it was very quite the journey in writing it. So thanks so much for having me today to speak. I'm also honored and humbled because as I look through this attendee list, I recognize a lot of names and acknowledge the fact that many of the attendees are veterans of Afghanistan as well and have very unique and interesting experiences, much more interesting than mine. So thanks for bearing with me as I share my thoughts on Afghanistan and the Canadian experience over there. So as mentioned before, I had the privilege of serving in Afghanistan with Canadian Forces on Task Force 308 from basically summer 2008 to May 2009 with the provincial reconstruction team. While I was there, I worked in Kandahar City as well as a Maiwan district and Panjwai district. Both very, very interesting places to work, both challenging places to work and both eye-opening areas of operation to be functioning in. When I returned from Afghanistan in October 2009, I was engaged by a Canadian company to work for on a project called the Arghan Dab Irrigation Rehabilitation Project, or otherwise known as the Dalla Dam Project. It was part of a CETA-funded project, a signature project for Canada in Afghanistan, roughly a $50 million project, which had a timeline of 3 years. So I initially was engaged as a local national engagement and contract on the contracting side, and then over some time I was brought in as the security advisor, at which time I worked with an incredible team of Canadian Forces veterans to manage security and general operations for the project for 3 years. So it gave me a great deal of experience with the culture and the people of Afghanistan, and particularly Kandahar. But as part of the project, I also spent a great deal of time in Kabul and some of the surrounding regions. I was reminded this morning of the impact of the Canadian Forces experience in Afghanistan, as I read a headline about the fact that Panjwai had fallen into the hands of the Taliban. So I have not yet been able to really digest what this means. I don't know if this is true or not. However, I do recognize that Panjwai, the Panjwai region, or the district of Panjwai, had a pretty significant role and was an area of operations that most Canadian Forces members served in while in Kandahar. So I think there'll be a bit of a fallout, and it might be in a very emotional moment should there be some truth to this matter. So I would share this, that my thoughts on Afghanistan specifically are that I had the incredible opportunity to listen and build relationships in Afghanistan in both roles, right? Prior to deploying, I had a very black and white version of what had happened in Afghanistan, good guys and bad guys. But after spending a great deal of time speaking to district leaders, police, AMP, auxiliary police, the ANA leadership, as well as professionals, particularly when I worked on the ARP project, doctors, lawyers, engineers, I began to understand the problem a little deeper and really the historic issues that existed in Afghanistan. Even more important was the grassroots thoughts of my language assistants, who were my lifeline. I continue to have deep relationship, very, very meaningful relationships with the language assistants that work for me over there in both capacities, and their thoughts and experiences of the challenges of working in Afghanistan were very unique, and specifically, gave me some really unique insight. So I'd share some thoughts. First off, that of colonialism, right? And it's a term which I don't use very lightly, but I recognize that it did have an impact there, and I'm quite sure from the perspective that I'm going to speak to it is more around the geographic features from treaties, right? And the fact that many of the lines in the sand that were drawn as part of this treaties are related to colonialism, and as various different exit strategies and treaties were signed, those lines in the sand created a great deal of conflict or complexities, I would say, and that led to conflict. It seems to be thematic throughout the world, particularly as you look at other conflicts that Canada's been involved with in both Yugoslavia and Africa, where ethnicity becomes divided by the fact that these lines in the sand do break up ethnic groups, and therefore create a great deal of challenge for those individuals that are caught on either side. In Afghanistan, this is particularly true when I think of the Pashtun population in the south, and particularly the impact of the Durand Line and how that divided that group of that tribal organization or tribal group, and the complexities that caused is pretty clear. I'm also reminded of colonialism when I think back as my time in Combat Outpost Maiwand, and particularly the Battle of Maiwande, right? And this battle that happened in 1880 was defined as a key battle of the Anglo-Afghan War. And what I found most interesting, and the reason I learned about this battle was specifically learning about Malalai, who was a female heroine of the story, which there's some debate over whether or not how much truthfulness there is to this story. However, was a story which I love to share with some elders when we were dealing with different gender issues. But particularly, I had the opportunity to visit her resting site, which was just outside of Maiwand. But as the story goes, she, in a fight in the Pashtun tribal fight against the British and Indian forces that were in Maiwand, she specifically helped rally in the fight as things were not going well and changed the tide of it, and which really took the momentum away from the British that were having a relatively successful campaign in Afghanistan at the time. I'll speak to ethnicity. Out of the lines in the sand that were drawn by the various treaties, and I've spoken a little bit about the Pashtun side of it, but we also have the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Baluch, and as well as the Hazara people that are also in Afghanistan. And when I first got over there, I wasn't really aware as to how deep that was. I'd taken a variety of different courses on understanding the cultural makeup of Afghanistan, but it wasn't as clear until I actually got on the ground and started to understand that, right? And truly that impact in Kandahar was clear, right? Why? Really the border was porous. That border between Pakistan and Afghanistan along the what would we consider the east part of Kandahar was very porous, and that was a result of poorly managed borders, but as well as created opportunities for armed opposition groups like the Taliban to grow with some success, right? Because they could very easily move within traditional migration routes back and forth from Pakistan into Afghanistan. And the other thing I would share, and once again, it's as was alluded to, it's a consequence of some of the outcomes of the 100 Years' War that Phil speaks about, is that the tribalism, and particularly within the Pashtun ethnicity, the division that was created there, specifically, within the Pashtun culture, you have the Ghilzai and the Durrani division. However, deeper, and particularly in Kandahar, you have the Papazai, Ashikzai, and Alkazai. And in that time I've spent in Afghanistan, I saw this becoming a major factor in power plays that were happening over there. And they were an added level of complexity as we tried to navigate the challenges there. Specifically, at the end of Canada's time in Kandahar in 2011, 2012, I would suggest that there was a major tribal shift in Afghanistan, in Kandahar, and most notably due to the assassination of President Karzai's brother, Hamid Walai Karzai, who was once again fell into the Papazai tribe. And I know that created a great power void. What happened when that occurred, and is a great example of tribalism at its finest. So those are my key thoughts on that. I'm sure, I think at the end, Ryan, we're going to have some opportunity to ask questions, so I'll stay on if anyone would like to do that, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Scott. Much appreciated. It was a fine introduction, and it was important context, I think, for understanding the many challenges in Canada's mission to Afghanistan. I think you've also brought enhanced authenticity to our proceedings, and we've certainly appreciated you sharing with us some of your extensive experience. As you just mentioned, attendees will have an opportunity to ask Scott, Phil, or myself any further questions at the end of the session, and you're welcome to insert your questions into the QA at any time. As a brief aside, I'm happy to remind our audience as well that the RCMI has enjoyed a long relationship with the Queen's Own Rifles Museum, where we've worked together on several successful collaborations, including our D-Day 75 commemoration in 2019. So thank you, Scott. And now I will introduce our next speaker. So Phil Halton, as mentioned, is a veteran and an author of today's featured book, Blood Washing Blood. He's also the author of 2 additional novels, Every Arm Outstretched and This Shall Be a House of Peace. His writing has also appeared in the Globe and Mail, the Canadian Army Journal, and additional periodicals. Phil holds a Master's of Defense Studies from the Royal Military College, and he has 20 years of experience as a reconnaissance officer. Phil has worked around the globe as a soldier and as a security consultant, including in Afghanistan. Phil also currently serves as the curator of the Queen's York Rangers Museum, based out of Fort York, which is a very fine regimental museum, if I might add. He currently lives in Toronto, Canada. Phil, please take it away.
Hey, cheers for that introduction, and thank you, Scott, for the thoughts to kind of get us going. You're right, I'm looking at the participant list as well, and there's a lot of folks who've had sort of had the sand in their ears, and so it's good actually to have people who know what you're talking about to have the discussion. And I love too that you brought up Malalai. That encouragement that she gave to Ayub Khan's forces in battle is one of the most famous 2-line poems or Lande poems in Pashtun poetry. It's such a great little poem. I gotta recite it. It's young love. If you do not fall in the battle of my wand, by God, someone is saving you, is a symbol of shame. Which is, I mean, geez, when your girlfriend tells you that, I mean, you gotta you gotta get stuck in. You gotta go and fight the battle. There's no turning around from that. Great tradition of poetry in Afghanistan, and I got a real kick out of some of it. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. So thanks so much for having me here this afternoon. To be honest, this is one of those kind of topics that it would be way easier for me to talk about it for 60 hours than for 60 minutes or 30 minutes or 20 minutes. There's just so much to unpack that it's really difficult to do it in a concise way, but I'm certainly going to give it my best try here. In terms of my own experience in Afghanistan, so I was never in Afghanistan as a soldier, never in uniform, but I was there as a civilian in 2001, 03, 04, 05, 07, and 2009. Living on the economy in a little house in Kandahar or up in the north or in Kabul, and having an opportunity, I think, to see the conflict in a different way, which I think is part of the reason that I was moved to write the book that I have. And I think, oftentimes when we talk about war, particularly wars that, we see as being, in history, our focus is on, battles, tactics, leaders, the forces involved, the weapons used. All of that is interesting, but it's not at all what I want to talk about. And it's not at all really what my book is about. Really what I've looked at, I use as a lens to look at the war in Afghanistan is a social lens, a human lens. Because I think that often gets forgotten, that essentially, just by the nature of the war in Afghanistan, it's a social conflict over social issues. And as soon as you start to use that lens, I think what is otherwise a very muddied, confusing war suddenly makes more sense. Because there was a point in my life where I thought that I knew a lot about Afghanistan. I was working in Afghanistan. I was being paid to know about Afghanistan and to analyze the conflict and to understand what was going on. But I realized that because of a particular incident one day that this really just wasn't the case. I went to visit a village in northern Afghanistan with some humanitarian workers to go and talk to the village about humanitarian projects, what kind of projects they wanted, what kind of projects were possible, et cetera. And so we were all seated in this communal garden on, carpets laid out on the ground, drinking tea and eating raisins and starting this long discussion when the meeting was interrupted. Someone threw a hand grenade over the wall of the garden and into the meeting. It exploded off in a corner. Some people were injured, nobody too seriously, other than the guy who threw the hand grenade, who was lynched by the mob just outside the garden. And, so at the time I'm trying why did this happen? What is this about? Who is the target? What's the purpose, etc. And long story short, essentially the whole thing happened because what we perceived to be a village was actually two villages. It was separated by a stream that was about 4 feet wide that worked its way through the houses. On one side of the stream were people who had lived in that village, whose families had lived in that village for a very long time. On the other side of the stream were a different group of people of the same ethnicity, but whose forebears had only come to the village 50, 60 years ago. And they saw themselves as two different groups, two different villages. And so when we decided to meet with one side of that community, the perception was that we were going to help them and not help the others. And so they used the means that they had available to try to disrupt that, because they saw aid in essence as a zero-sum game. That if someone else got something, that they would therefore get nothing. And that's when I realized that we really didn't really didn't know, even on a basic level, what was going on in Afghanistan. And the more that I dug, and the more that I tried to find the people who did understand what was going on, the more I came across things like this. And so this is an actual PowerPoint slide from 2010 that was used to brief General McChrystal when he was the commander there in Afghanistan. Now, he's got a good sense of humor. When he saw this, he said, you know, when we understand this slide, we'll have won the war. But this slide was meant to, this was the explanation of what the war was about. You know, and if you can just unpick all this, that the solution is somewhere here. And, you know, in a sense, I'm amazed. I think that we, the West, have collectively spent tremendous effort to misunderstand the conflict in Afghanistan, you know, to shoehorn this conflict into our own frameworks, our own mental frameworks, and that we're constantly surprised when it doesn't seem to fit and things don't work the way that we think they do. And so, you know, the question of, you know, what is the war in Afghanistan even about then? And I'm doing this presentation a little backwards, and I already had said this to Ryan, but before I have presented my thesis and my explanation, and then all the questions were, it's like, well, what about this? What about this? You didn't talk about this. You didn't talk about that. And so, in fact, what I'm going to talk about is what the war in Afghanistan's not about. Before I hit you in the end with the thesis, but because it's complex and long, I'm only going to skim the wave tops. And so certainly if I don't go deep enough into something, then I'm happy to answer your questions at the end and dive in wherever you want. But I would suggest that much of what we think we know about the war are actually just myths. And a lot of times they're myths that we have propagated. So the first of these myths really is around Osama bin Laden and 9/11. Now, surely that's the proximate cause for American involvement, recent American involvement in Afghanistan. But that's really it. It has no other real deep-seated impact on the ongoing conflict, right? Because Osama bin Laden and other foreign fighters who were there during the Soviet period, you know, were less than 1%. Much less than 1% of the total number of mujahideen who fought both the Russians and the communist Afghan government. They were never particularly effective as a fighting force. They were never actually particularly trusted by the Afghans, who you know, don't trust people who live in the district next door because they're foreign, much less people who actually come from foreign countries. Most foreign fighters didn't speak any of the local languages, never really integrated. And so their impact in a lot of ways I would say, has been greatly overstated. And in fact, the fact that Afghanistan was invaded after 9/11 is in essence like an accident of history. Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan really because he had been ejected from Sudan and that he'd lost his Saudi citizenship for criticizing the Saudi government. If he had been less vocal in his criticism, he may have been living in Saudi Arabia at the time that the 9/11 attacks took place. May have been living in Sudan or somewhere else. And so, as I say, it's a bit of an accident. And really, the Taliban sheltered Osama bin Laden, not because of his views, but despite them. There was quite a bit of internal discord about whether it was a good idea to provide him and his family and his followers shelter. There is this cultural concept of Melmastia, which is a Pashtun concept of the obligation to not just provide for a guest, but to protect a guest against all comers. But even that has its limits. There was quite a bit of discussion prior to 9/11 about having Osama bin Laden handed over by the Afghan government to either the Americans or the Saudis. And in fact, the Taliban had agreed to hand him over with conditions. those conditions were unacceptable, that he be tried by a Islamic court was the major condition. But, you know, their support of him was not as monolithic as it is suggested. And really, more than anything, it was about his own personal relationship with Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban at the time. It's interesting as well, and it was expressed to me in 2003, you know, that there was a large reward, $25 million, if I remember, offered for Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And a Pashtun elder said to me, that makes it clear what this is about. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, if he's a wanted international criminal who has committed horrendous crimes, you don't need to pay us $25 million to hand him over. We would just do the right thing. The fact that you're offering $25 million implies that it's the wrong thing. If you have to pay us to do it, then it implies that that it's dirty, it's underhanded, which is a different perspective than the one that I think you hear most often. I think the second big myth is really that drugs fuel the insurgency. And I think the common understanding is that the Taliban, are running a huge heroin ring. And that's not really true. That's essentially, in fact, it's essentially wrong. The truth is that drugs are indirectly benefiting both sides, or directly benefiting both sides of the conflict, both the government and the Taliban. Now, opium has a very long history in Afghanistan. It's been legal, or at least widely tolerated throughout most of this history. When it was legal next door in British India, there was quite a bit of opium grown in Afghanistan and smuggled into British India to join the legitimate opium trade. During the First World War and the Second World War, it was a source of medical morphine. The major producer prior to the First World War of medical morphine was Turkey. Obviously, they were not available to the Allies during the First World War, and so they needed to find other sources. And Afghanistan became one of those sources. And Afghanistan actually has been a major producer of opium and heroin for the Iranian market for many, many years. And opium use has been widely tolerated in Iran for centuries. And it's true that some of the Mujahideen groups during the Soviet period benefited from drug production, but actually a fairly limited amount of it, given that they were receiving funding, international funding from both the Islamic world and from the United States. They didn't need additional funding. So it really exploded actually when that funding was cut off. And those groups suddenly really needed the money in essence. But the Taliban involvement isn't what it's often suggested to be. As a larger organization, most of the benefit is actually from taxation, from taxing growers, taxing traders, and taxing the producers who take it from opium to heroin. Very much like many of the government agencies who are involved, who are corrupt, and also tax farmers, traders, and producers. It's interesting that really the only effective eradication of opium growing in Afghanistan was in 2001 under the Taliban government. There's a certain amount of debate about why they eradicated it. Some suggest that it was to actually inflate the price. And so they had stored opium that would then increase in value. I think that's possible. But it's also possible that their longstanding policy has been to tolerate opium rather than to embrace it. And so to destroy it, it was not actually out of character necessarily. I'd suggest also that when you think about the amount of effort that the West has put into eradication of opium in Afghanistan, but yet every year there's more and more and more of it grown, it just doesn't make sense until you recognize that both government and insurgent actors are all benefiting from opium. There's really no one in Afghanistan who benefits from eradication. And so there's really no one in Afghanistan who's working for it. The monies that government actors take out of that system are paying militias, paying bribes, buying businesses and homes in Afghanistan and outside of it. And I would actually say that really both sides are essentially benefiting equally from the drug trade. We mentioned the president's brother who was assassinated, 10 years ago now. Some would suggest that there was a tribal element to that. He was also one of the largest drug kingpins in the country, if not the largest drug kingpin in the country. And so it could also have been a business matter. And the fact that the president's brother, could be a governor of a province and a massive producer and trafficker of heroin shouldn't shock you if you have a sense of what's going on there. Drugs are also the grease of the Afghan economy, right? And so it's worth about $1.5 billion a year last year. It employs about 10% of the population, and that's farmers, traders, the whole ecosystem around opium farming and drug production. It provides about 1/3 of the gross domestic product of the country. And so even if you could wave a magic wand and make all the drugs disappear in Afghanistan, all you would do is really collapse the economy and cause the country to fail. And just to kind of put it in scale, in the early 1980s, Afghanistan was producing somewhere between 200 and 500 metric tons of opium a year. Now it's somewhere north of 8,000 tons a year. And so, again, clearly, it's really not in any Afghan's interest to eradicate opium and heroin. There's also a very large addict population in Afghanistan that doesn't often get talked about. The population is about 32 million people. There hasn't been a census in a very long time, but roughly 32 million. And in that population, 2 to 2.5 million people are addicts, which is a huge social drain. In addition, something that's not often talked about is opium is fairly easy to grow. It doesn't require a lot of irrigation, but it requires some, particularly in the south where the land is quite dry. And so it's become so profitable for farmers that they're expanding the land used for agriculture, specifically to grow opium, and then putting their profits into infrastructure. So deeper wells, solar power. And in fact, there's a huge solar power boom in southwestern Afghanistan that is entirely related to the drug trade in order to power pumps for those deep wells. And it's actually to the extent that it's causing desertification in southwestern Afghanistan and drought. And aside from the current political crisis, the next big crisis in Afghanistan is likely to be the displacement of people in southwestern Afghanistan whose land is no longer arable. But again, it's not often discussed. The smart historical view about Afghanistan has often been as well that, that it's a continuation of the Great Game, that in fact, Afghanistan, they're merely pawns. And, Pakistan in particular gets held out as really the power behind the conflict. And I would suggest that that's overblown. Pakistan has been involved in the conflict, continues to be involved in the conflict, provided tremendous support to the Mujahideen groups in the 70s late 70s and 80s. But really the conflict couldn't continue at the rate that it is simply because of the meddling of foreign powers. They can exacerbate the conflict, but they're not creating it. The vast majority of the fighting is if not all, is Afghan on Afghan, and it's about Afghan issues. And in fact, it's convenient both for Western powers to kind of point a finger at Pakistan, but particularly for the Afghan government to point a finger at Pakistan, and to talk about the Taliban as essentially foreign invaders, or puppets of foreign powers. Because to do that, you don't have to admit that the Taliban are almost entirely Afghan citizens who are so thoroughly disappointed, if you will, with the Afghan government, they continue to fight. They've taken up arms, or they continue to take up arms. Because as soon as you admit that, then we admit that the Afghan government is itself failing its own citizenry. So it's much more convenient for those powers to ignore the fact that the Taliban are dissatisfied Afghans. In terms of foreign thoughts on this, it's not unlike the United States blaming Laos and Cambodia, for their loss in the Vietnam War, right? It's not really true. Certainly, in that case, they exacerbated the conflict. They made it more complex and more difficult. But the issue was inside of the country, the local citizenry, and their opinions on what's going on. And I know there's lots more to be said about that, and we can certainly go into that more deeply if you'd like. I think the fourth myth is really about warring tribes, and it's the idea that Afghans just fight, it's what they do. It's tribes fighting tribes, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I've heard that coming from otherwise very intelligent people who are paid a lot of money to understand this conflict and come up with a fairly intellectually lazy answer. And linked to this as well is that the wider conflict in Afghanistan is essentially tribal or ethnic, that the Taliban are Pashtun, that they're fighting against a government that best represents the other ethnicities in the country, particularly in the north. But these kind of simplifications ignore a lot of things, right? That, since 2001, we've had a Pashtun president of Afghanistan, be that Karzai or Ashraf Ghani. Many of the most prominent anti-Taliban fighters in the last 30 years were Pashtuns, be that Pir Gayani, Abdullah, or others. So while the Taliban has a lot of Pashtun members, it's not actually a Pashtun movement. It sees itself as a supra-tribal movement, like above or beyond the tribes. And it actually has targeted tribal leadership in a lot of places, really to break down the strength of the tribes. Interestingly, so have coalition operations, right? Have targeted a lot of tribal leaders to the point that the tribes are actually not as powerful a political entity as they were 20, 30, 50 years ago. They have been very heavily attrited by the fighting and targeted in the fighting by all sides. And we've burned a lot of intellectual energy trying to map out the tribal aspects of the conflict without really understanding what Afghan identity is about. And Afghan identity is what we should be talking about rather than tribalism, because your identity is your family, your clan, and your tribe, certainly, but it's also where you live, what job you have, who you went to school with, what they call end-the-wall networks, who you fought with or who you fought for previously. It's all of these things that create a complex identity that really is what people are cohesing around, groups are cohesing around. And that's even more complex than simply tribalism. Like these tribal org charts that we see are almost always wrong, because tribalism isn't static in Afghanistan either. Groups migrate within that org chart as they come under protection of dominant groups locally. In some cases, tribes are seen in one part of the country as belonging to one group and in another part of the country belonging to another. And, you know, I was trying to think of an example that sort of makes this make more sense, but it's like as if you were trying to guess, you know, what hockey team a Canadian supported. And you say, well, they were born in Montreal, but they lived in Vancouver, and, you know, but their dad's from Toronto, and they're like all these kind of things that would lead you to support one particular hockey team or another. And you could look at all of those factors and try to draw the lines and links and come up with your deduction, and you could be totally wrong. Right? That they're a Hartford Whalers fan from way back. You know what I mean? Like so the analysis, I think, has often led us in the wrong directions. Islamic extremism is another that gets trotted out quite a bit, which I think is particularly wrong, right? So Islam in Afghanistan traditionally has been of the Sufi strain, which is a mystical strain of, and not at all very fundamentalist strain of of Islam. The Taliban themselves were largely Deobandi, which is Deobandism is a school of Islam from India, and is again itself not particularly extreme. There are a few Wahhabists within the Taliban. The Saudis funded schools during that Mujahideen period that taught Wahhabist thought. But there's actually, you can find quite a bit of conflict between traditional Islam in Afghanistan and Wahhabists, because in Afghanistan, the traditional way of being Muslim doesn't sit well with the extremists, particularly around the worship of saints, which is a key part of Sufism, and similar, if you will, to the way that a Catholic might ask a saint to intercede for them. The same, a Sufi would do the same. And so there are shrines to saints all over the place. And in fact, that, you know, the grave of Malala of Maiwand is somewhere that people go to pray for her intercession in their lives. And extremists don't accept this, right? And so you see the destruction of some of these shrines by Wahhabists, which creates a major backlash from the local community. Which is another reason why a lot of foreign fighters are actually not accepted in Afghanistan. I mean, we see things like the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, or strange laws put in place by the Taliban when they were the government. These are actually really, more often than not, about local concerns, like Afghan political concerns, than they are really about religious concerns. You know, in fact, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, more than anything, was about sending a message to the local Hazaras, an ethnic group who are Shia, that the Taliban, you know, had little regard for them or their history, and we continue to see attacks against the Hazara people by the Taliban even today. You know, and it's interesting as well to think that the Islamic State in Khorasan province, which was created in Afghanistan, essentially because the Taliban were seen as insufficiently extreme by a fairly small piece of the population. They've essentially been destroyed. They got very, very little support in Afghanistan, and they were destroyed in joint operations between the Taliban and the government. So again, Islamic extremism is not the driver of the conflict in Afghanistan that sometimes it's suggested that it is. And then the final myth that I want to talk about is really women's rights. And so, and this is a myth that I think Canada, actually, among all the folks in it who interceded in Afghanistan, has worked the hardest to propagate, because it plays well to a Canadian domestic audience. You know, we don't like the idea of going to war, but it sounds way better if we're doing it, you know, to make sure that Afghan girls get to go to school. But the truth of the matter is that the Taliban's excesses against their own people, men and women, in Afghanistan when they were the government, really didn't get much play in the international press until 1997, when they stopped the delegation of European Commission for Humanitarian Affairs delegates and held them for a couple of hours because they were taking photographs inside of a women's hospital. But just to underline that, under the Taliban government, there was a women's hospital. The Taliban as an organization were not and are not actually monolithic. And so even today, you see areas that are essentially controlled by the Taliban in Afghanistan with girls who go to school. You see other areas that are ostensibly controlled by the government where girls don't go to school. And, you know, in Eastern Afghanistan, which is part of the Pashtun heartland, girls have gone to school essentially continuously throughout this whole conflict, because that's part of their culture, and how, you know, they see the role of women. It's interesting as well that, you know, the burqa, which we see a burqa here, you know, has become a symbol of Taliban oppression of women in Afghanistan, but nobody really seems to ask, like, why. It's been 20 years since the Taliban fell. Why are almost all the women even in the capital in Afghanistan still wearing burqas? If the Taliban imposed this, why, now that they're gone, does it continue? And the answer is that it's, you know, because it's complex. The burqa is essentially a symbol of middle class Pashtun culture that has spread to the other ethnic groups in Afghanistan before the Taliban. It was actually a reaction to communist policies in the 1970s, where you started to see a divide in society, where some people, you know, were becoming more modern. And this is where you see those photographs of Afghan women in miniskirts with lipstick going to university. At the same time, there are other women who were becoming more conservative, and expressing that conservatism through things like the burqa. And the truth of the matter as well is that through all the different social upheavals and gyrations in the last 50 years, Afghan society as it is today, across the board, is incredibly conservative, particularly outside of the major cities. It's incredibly conservative. And it's not just the Taliban who are parts of the Taliban who have conservative views about women. It's a lot of non-Taliban as well. It's a lot of Afghan people. But it's been convenient to kind of hang this issue as a Taliban issue, as opposed to a Afghan social issue, again, as an aspect of sort of essentially affixing blame and making the conflict seem more palatable to a Western domestic audience. You know, and we've already kind of given the reveal here, but I think our misunderstanding of the war is actually so profound that we collectively don't really even know when it started, which is really the thesis of my book, is talking about when that is. And I'd suggest that's the date, the 20th of February, 1919, which is oddly specific, but it was on that date that Amanullah Amir's father was assassinated, probably by Amanullah Amir, and Amanullah Amir became king. He was a very modern reformer. We see him here with his wife, notice not wearing a burqa, receiving an honorary doctorate at Oxford University. And, you know, he saw himself as an Afghan Ataturk, you know, as a modernizer in that sense, and enacted a huge list of reforms. These reforms sound really familiar to us today, like a secular law code, national conscription, a mandatory education for women, Western style education, you know, et cetera. And the reaction to this was immediate and violent. You know, in the first year of his reforms, there was a huge tribal uprising in Eastern Afghanistan over the issue of child marriage, you know, pro and con. And about 8,000 people were killed in fighting with the Afghan National Army. You know, and essentially these kinds of issues have continued to be what Afghans are fighting each other about today. Now, he was deposed in 1929 and a lot of his reforms were repealed, but we see the same issues coming up again and again, but also the same people, the same families, the same tribes. It's the same groups in society that continue to fight. Because essentially, the issue, the cross-cutting issue in the last 100 years of the conflict is about where power resides between these three poles. Either a central government, religious authorities, or local authorities, which could be tribal or non-tribal. Because of the major ethnicities in Afghanistan, the Pashtuns are the only ones who are tribal. The others actually don't have tribes. And so, you can see at any point in Afghan history kind of where the bubble sits between these things. Amanullah tried to pull it hard to central government, and he undercut the authority of religious leaders and of the local tribal authorities, and they responded. The Taliban, pulled it hard to the religious authorities. Even when they were the government, they essentially didn't form a central government. They didn't form the organs of central government. They didn't feel it was necessary. And they took quite a bit of authority away from local leaders. So you see it, this is in essence what the whole thing is about. And if you're, other than asking questions today, if there's more that you want to learn, then Blood Washing Blood is the history of all of this. But This Shall Be a House of Peace is as we said, is a novel, but is really about the rise of the Taliban movement. And I think gives a good sense of the conditions that they grew in, and their thinking. And it's interesting because I think it's a moral tale. And I'm always curious to know where people, where they get off the bus. At what point they say to themselves, okay, now I morally, I can't go any further. But people go a lot farther than they think. Because I think that we often suggest that the Taliban are not rational actors. And they are. There is a rationality to what they do. People don't wake up in the morning wanting to be evil. They're the heroes in their story. And I think we often forget that. So I have used at least of my time. So thank you for listening to that explanation. I'm very happy to take whatever questions you might have, either about what I've spoken about or about current events in Afghanistan, which might be of interest as well. So Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, Phil, for that fine speech. Obviously, as mentioned, these continue to be important and very timely themes. I actually found your approach at dismantling the myths of Afghanistan to be quite compelling and rather productive to truly understanding what's been going on there, especially over the last 20 years since we've had Canadian involvement. And I really liked your note on the complexities of Afghan and tribal identities, which are, like those in the other myths, are often simplified, and which leads to great misinformation and misunderstanding. So thank you again for your talk. I'll speak on behalf of our audience when I say we love having these talks, related to Canada's modern military. There's often an emphasis, a natural emphasis, on First and Second World War topics and our collections in our museum. So we're thankful to have this content here today. I'd welcome both you and Scott to come to the RCMI once we reopen, and I'd be happy to show you some of our galleries. So the book is Blood Washing Blood. It's now available from Chapters Indigo and on Amazon online. Before we move to our Q&A here, I just want to say a few quick thank yous. Obviously, thank you to our panelists. Phil, Scott, thank you for your part and for lending your experiences and authenticity to the proceedings. Thanks to our museum committee and our chair, Bill Hines, our museum staff, our RCMI staff, specifically Sylvia Lau and Eric Morris for their work and support. Thank you all, and to our attendees for participating. As always, that's how we keep all of this going. So thanks to everyone involved, and be happy to take the Q&As at this time. So feel free to submit them in the Q&A box, and I will direct them to our panelists. So we just have a couple here so far. This first question is for Scott. Scott, this question comes from Jim Lutz. Jim, as Scott, you're familiar with, he's a venerable Vietnam War veteran. He's also on the board of the Queen's Own Rifles Museum and on the RCMI Museum Committee. So Jim asks you, Scott, what skills that you learned as a reserve training were most helpful in the active combat zone?
I would say patience. I think that was one of the things that the reserves teaches very well is the ability to have patience, to be adaptable and flexible, but finally, how to scrounge. I hate to say it. When I was on the deployment, my job, I was a warrant officer, where initially I was the quartermaster and sergeant major, and it was very interesting, a little bit of wearing a lot of different hats at the same time. But the situation I walked into was not a good one with regards to equipment and meeting our needs, because our construct was changing, and the reserves definitely taught me how to scrounge and how to find things, and I was able to do that to some extent. And then finally, relationships. I was very fortunate to deploy with many that I had served with for many in different capacities. A lot of members from my unit where we had close relationships. So when we were left alone or left to our own devices, and sometimes in situations where we had very limited support, we were able to make do and find a way to make things happen. So thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Scott, and for Jim for your question. This next question is for Phil. It comes from James McPherson. He asks, has China avoided involvement in Afghanistan? And if so, how?
Sure. So China actually has largely pursued commercial interests in Afghanistan, particularly like copper mining. Is one area that they've invested quite a bit of money. There isn't any evidence that I'm aware of the Chinese recently funding any of the various armed groups in Afghanistan, though in the past, certainly in the 70s and 80s, they had a limited involvement there. I think, one of the main concerns that China has at the moment is that potential blowback of Islamic extremists back into Afghanistan, because there have been small numbers of Chinese foreign fighters. And just given that the sort of the sensitivity of that sort of thing in China, you have seen some of their involvement in tracking those individuals and preventing their return to China. But no, they haven't been a major power player, certainly compared to others.
Thanks, Phil, and for the question, James. This next one is for Phil. It comes from Mike Clary. Mike actually serves on both the board of the RCMI and on our RCMI Museum Committee. He's also an engineer in Canada's Armed Forces. Mike asks, Phil, with the premise that the Western forces will not have any significant influence going forward, what does the future in Afghanistan look like? How will the internal interests sort themselves out?
Yeah, so do you know what I think is interesting? There's been all kinds of news lately about districts falling to the Taliban. Panjwai was one that fell yesterday, according to Afghan news, and the number of districts and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a certain amount of BS to this, right? Because when we say that the district fell, what we actually mean is that the hukumat, like the district headquarters, the district government's office, which often is a combination of the district governor, the police, and like everybody else, that the district governor has left, and that the police and the military have surrendered or left, and the Taliban have moved into the office. But that's not enduring, right? Like that can get reversed in a heartbeat. It's embarrassing for the Afghan government, without question, but when the district has fallen, it's not because of pitched battles and the seizure of dominant features, and it's eminently reversible. I think, what we're seeing at the moment, and it's very damning, is things are actually returning to the way it was in early 2001, because none of the issues have been resolved. And so you hear, particularly in the north, militia leaders talking about a second resistance is how they're calling it. And that's actually the name of one of the new militia groups that's being formed by Ahmad Massoud, the famous Massoud's son. Though it's also a rallying cry. You know, the people involved in these militias are the same people who were fighting the Taliban in the late 90s and 2001. Ismail Khan, Rashid Dostum, Ada Noor Ustarata, and now Ahmad Massoud rather than his father. And it's the reason that the conflict is going back to the way it was 20-something years ago, with the same players, the same groups, the same issues, the same places. It's because nothing's changed. You know, none of the underlying issues have been resolved, and so they've got to figure it out in a sense. In essence, like they've got to resolve this, and then you'll have some kind of enduring solution. I think the only sort of little glimmer of hope is there is actually a growing peace movement in Afghanistan. A lot of young Afghans are not interested in this, in continuing to fight, and that's also a women's peace movement. And you've seen some truces happen in the last 5 years that were either the Taliban or the government called a truce. And oftentimes the government called the unilateral truce and the Taliban refused, but then low-level Taliban fighters said, forget it, we're going to have a truce after all. You know, and so you saw Taliban leaders and provincial governors meeting and praying together against the direction of the higher Taliban leadership. You know, and so I think that's the real glimmer of hope, is that people finally get sick of continuing this conflict and find some other way to resolve it. That's my take. Scott, you may have a different take entirely.
No, I think that there's a lot to be said about managing the borders and where that goes. I don't know if that's going to be a viable solution, but I think that over time and education, things could change. But it's been 20 some odd years now, and 20 years now, and it's there's a lot of unresolved stuff, and actually I think sometimes the axe has been dug deeper, right? So there's even greater divide happening. But I do agree with your comment with regards to you know, when we talk about the fall of Panjwai, and you know, and what that looks like, and what's really happening there. And I would suggest that there's a lot of misunderstanding as to, you know, what level of control actually existed there in the first place, right? So
excellent. Thanks, Phil and Scott, and to Mike Clary for the question. This next one is for both of you guys as well. You're welcome to answer in turn. Phil and Scott. This is from Chris Waddy. Curious about your take on the narrative of the Afghan war in the West in general and Canada in particular. How do you think the war was portrayed in Canada versus the myth/realities? How did it change the mission?
Do you want to go first, Scott, or you?
no, I'll let you go, and maybe
we're all just fighting for a bit of time to digest that one.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
I think the narrative in Canada, I already talked about the women's issues. You know, that was a lens that the Canadian government chose to apply to the conflict. Cynically, I think that that was really for a Canadian audience more so than an Afghan one. Speaking to Afghans about women's issues, in some cases, I got a fair deal of kind of confusion. They're like, we don't understand. Why are you Canadians so interested in this when there are 1,000 other issues that we think are more important? You know, but I don't think that we really have seen a clear Canadian portrayal of the conflict in Afghanistan. Because I think, you know, like films, media that will kind of coalesce people's understanding of the war. Maybe there hasn't been enough time, but I don't think that, you know, Afghan Luke or Hyena Road or there hasn't been, you know, a concise explanation to the Canadian public of what that was all about. And maybe that will come.
So Scott, did you want to weigh in as well?
Yeah, I think maybe when we look at the Canadian forces experience in Afghanistan, I mean, there's a couple things that I think were portrayed in the media, particularly as momentum grew there and post 2005-6, was the impact of the whole of government approach, and what that looked like with the other government organizations working there, be it CETA, DFATE, Corrections Canada, the RCMP, that was definitely something that I saw with my work with quite a bit. I'm not saying it was ineffective, but I would suggest that it was probably, it did present some unique challenges for us as well, right? But the pillars of the key pillars of, and I always remember this being a reporting piece for us, which was security, governance, and development, and what that looked like, and how we balance those over on the mission and what happened there. I think that was the development piece was definitely played up. It did have its challenges, and the three kind of key projects that existed there: polio eradication, education, and irrigation. There was a lot of money put into those, and I would, if one looks at a project such as the Dalla Dam, what the actual measures of effectiveness and impact was. I would love to still see that data. I never got the chance to see it, right? So, and then finally, I would add COIN. The concept that we were effectively involved in counterinsurgency operations is I remember seeing many different lectures from various different leaders about how amazing our COIN campaign was and our ink spot was, and then I realized when I got there that maybe that's not necessarily as shared, right? So that ink spot necessarily wasn't flowing out like the pen I left in the dryer, right? So it was definitely something that was would be, I think, maybe sold to the public, but we definitely needed a concentration of force that was different. I think we started getting that later on in 2010 when we started consolidating forces and bringing with the surge piece that came in from the US. But I think those different approaches shared were romanticized versions of what we did over there, and definitely helped make a positive perception of the Canadian forces, which was all good work and incredible work that was happening there. But they were different, not necessarily reflective of the ground truth. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, guys, for that, and to Chris for the question. We just have a couple more here. Just want to bear with us. There's a lot of great interest. This next question is for Phil. It's from David Mack. He says, to summarize the argument, what we are witnessing is a dialogue between modernizing elements and a conservative reactionary behavior. With the foundations of Sufism, which is not non-traditional, is there a future Afghanistan that is relevant in the 21st century?
I guess, quite like relevant to who? Relevant to what? I think that there is potential, for a cohesive future with Sufism in the mix. And in fact, those three poles of power, I think to greater or lesser degrees, are actually all required. And that while, folks like the Taliban have really tried to push it to a unipolar approach, and as did Amanullah, actually, who saw a unipolar approach to power, the central government being it. That Afghan society works best when there's the right balance between the three. So because you can have an Islamic-based constitution and Islamic-based law that isn't extreme, that doesn't pose a danger to other countries, right? That is acceptable to the average Afghan, and in which there's a role for men and women as well. We see this even in Canada, right? That politics are local, and having the right amount of power at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels actually makes things work, best. And so, in 2001, when the constitutional law jirga was ongoing, the big push from the Afghans was actually to have a very decentralized regional model of government. But the push from the Americans was to have a highly centralized model because they felt it would be simpler to engage with. So Afghanistan now actually has one of the most centralized models of government in the world. Even like provincial governors are appointed rather than elected, and so this model of government wouldn't work in a lot of different places. And even at its most extreme, what the Taliban were trying to achieve is essentially Saudi Arabia without the oil. Like that's the government model that they were looking for. So I think there's within these bounds, there's quite a few different models that would work. And maybe, just maybe, with less Western interests, sort of poking their fingers in the pie, they might actually be able to find that balance.
Thank you for that. Just a couple last questions to sum it all up. This is for both of you guys. Comes from Anna England of Defining Moments Canada. She asks, you touched upon the development of women's issues in Afghanistan. Did you have many personal encounters with women there from both sides of the debate? How did they respond or react to the Western presence there? Go ahead, Scott. I'll put you on the spot this time.
Yeah, no problem. So I'll share three very quick experiences. The first one was when I first deployed to Kandahar. I was told in my handover that they'd done this incredible thing where they've hired a locally employed person to work at the PRT who was female. It was the very first female that had been hired. And so I thought, oh, this is fantastic. She spoke English, Dari, Pashto, and it was wonderful. So I prepared for her arrival, and and I thought, well, hey, I'll just put her in this office by where our main offices were. Well, when she showed up, immediately I was greeted with like opposition from other locally employed folks that were working at the PRT, as well as my interpreters, right? Because they were upset that she was single, and the fact that she was working within the area where our the Canadian Forces males work, right? So I changed it, and I said, awesome, I'm going to give her her own office closer to where the language assistants were, and and I moved everything around, and they didn't want her there, right? And they were upset because those men were single, and this wasn't going to work. So I came up with this brilliant idea. I found where the married locally employed person, well, they were in a weather haven. I put a divider up, but they could kind of see her, and I said she can work out of here. And I was met with incredible opposition once again because she was single, and that doesn't work out very well. So finally, I was at a loss for words. This is over the course of 3 days, and then on the final day, she came in and she said she's not going to work there anymore because on her way in, there was 2 layers of security. The first one was a local national security guard force private security team and the group that would do it, and then there was the Canadian Forces folks that would do the final screening. Well, on the way in, they grabbed her cell phone, got her phone number, and her family was now being harassed because she was coming into the PRT. So she no longer felt safe, and that was it. So it lasted about 4 days. I don't know if it was ever done afterwards, but it just goes to show that the unique challenges that we faced and that she faced. There was several incredible female CAF members that were responsible for running Shura, CAF Central, female Shuras or women issue Shuras that were run. And I seem to remember the incredible opposition. I think the one that was run at the Panjwai District Center was met with an incredible amount of opposition in the form of IEDs placed on the road that day where that was taking place. But finally, I would say and on the opposite end, we had some incredible female CAF members that were serving with us, and particularly I remember being in one place where we were playing volleyball, and I had 2 female soldiers with me that were playing volleyball, and they were dressed very conservatively, but we were playing with the Afghan army or against them at one point, and it was very uneasy feeling because they had their cell phones out, right? And it was when the flip phone, cell phone cameras and videos had first come out. And, it was incredibly uncomfortable feeling for those members, that was for sure. And, there's a degree of kind of not knowing how to interact with females, with over there between the Afghans and then the Afghan soldiers, and specifically the female Canadian Forces personnel, right? So I know there was some positive experiences that also occurred, but I just remember watching that videotaping taking place and how awkward and almost childish it was, right? So I'll leave. Those are my 3 experiences that I'll share.
Thanks for that, Scott. Would you like to weigh in as well, Phil, on women's issues in Afghanistan?
Yeah, just quickly, and I think those are really telling stories from Scott, and just a reminder that those aren't the Taliban who feel that way. Those are the modern pro-Western folks who feel that way, right? So, as I say, it's a very conservative society, particularly around women's issues, and that's kind of across the board. Because I lived on the economy, and worked in my office, everyone I worked with were Afghans. I didn't have an opportunity really to interact with a lot of women because as an Afghan man, you don't. I made the mistake of asking one of my staff about his family. I said, well, I forget there was some problems and there's some fighting in the city, and I said, oh, are your wife and children okay? And he's like, don't ask me about my wife and children. Like it's none of your business, And I said, well, I try to explain. Like, I'm just trying to be nice, and I'm asking about your family and make sure that everything's okay at home. And he's like, there's no good reason to ask about my wife and my children. Like, there's no acceptable reason for that. It's none of your business. And that's, that idea of purdah, of separation, is very strongly felt. The one opportunity I did have to interact with Afghan women is I worked on a project with the wife of one of the major Mujahideen group leaders from the 80s. So Pir Gayani, his wife, Madam Gayani, is an Afghan human rights campaigner, particularly around women's rights. And she was comfortable to meet with me directly and look me in the eye and speak to me. Though I must admit, I never met her without her husband present. And through her, got a bit of a better sense of I guess the actual conditions of women. A lot of her projects were around helping widows, because a widow is really in a lot of trouble in Afghanistan, because without a man to essentially interact with society for them, they're very much cut off. It's very hard for a widow to get a job, for example, right? Because Afghan women mostly don't have jobs. It's hard for them to go to the market to buy food, because Afghan women don't do that without an escort, a male escort, male family member. And like a woman who's been married can't return to her birth family. Once you're married, you're out of that family. You're in your husband's family, and if they reject the widow, then they're really on their own. And so, some really incredible work being done by Madam Gayani and international NGOs to find acceptable livelihoods for widows. So I guess short answer, no, not a lot of interaction, because that's how the society works. And it's not to underestimate like the difficulty that women experience in Afghanistan. But again, the issue isn't the Taliban, it's Afghanistan and Afghans.
Thank you both for your insight into that important question, and to Anna for the question. Last question here. I'm actually going to amalgamate a couple of them. And this is to both of you and for myself as well. Now that the US is withdrawn from Afghanistan, what's next? And further to that, what might Afghanistan look like if it returns to the way it was? And just a side question for Phil at the end of this. Phil, had you any thought of going back to Afghanistan when able to do so? Scott, why don't we start with you on your thoughts on what's to come in the coming months and years in Afghanistan?
I'm hopeful that the hysteria behind some of the changes that are taking place or allegedly taking place will slow down. I do think that it's a deep conversation, but I think the Taliban exists for a reason. I think that there has been some reforms there where there might be some form of opportunity to have a balance of power that is effective, and let's see where it goes. But we might be in a space where over time, we might find some success, right? And the solution is their solution, and they'll have to figure out where that lies. I just, obviously, we're always fearful of the impact and the human rights abuses that can take place should that get out of hand. But very hopeful that they might find a unique space to be based on the interventions that have happened, and also maybe even changes around the Taliban and the way in which they view things as well, right? So shared power, balance of power, we might get there. So I'll leave it at that.
Well said. Thank you, Scott. And Phil, same question for you. What's next for Afghanistan? Go ahead.
Well, I think, in some ways it's 2001 all over again, or the late 90s all over again. But, there was a push at one point for some kind of power sharing agreement between the Taliban and the current government. But in fact, neither the Taliban nor the current government are interested in that. That was a Western desire. Current government doesn't feel that they should share power with the Taliban because the Taliban weren't elected. Taliban don't feel that they need to because they'll take power. And so until that tension gets worked out, then I think, there's going to be continued conflict. I think the thing that is creating space for the Taliban to continue to exist more than anything is the issue of corruption. That most Afghans don't trust the Afghan government, the central government. It's shown itself to be massively corrupt in the last 20 years. And in some ways, the more money that we pour into Afghanistan, the more opportunities there are for corruption and the more lucrative corruption becomes. So in some ways, I'd suggest that the last 20 years of Western intervention has done nothing but prolong the conflict, right? Because we haven't really allowed the Afghans to sort out the underlying issues, and our presence, as you saw, like even at a really tactical level in the South, like the decision to create an ink spot and put a platoon house in a village often became a magnet for fighting rather than settling a district, right? And so I think it's going to be ugly how the conflict gets settled, but we have to allow the conflict to settle. And I hope that what it looks like is a loose government, where regional powers have their say and are respected. And I think that actually has a lot more durability than the current style of government.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for your insights and your participation today. I think it's been a great session. You've both brought a lot of authenticity and a lot of experience to this debate, this discussion. So thank you both again. I hope we can collaborate with the RCMI again in the future. Reach out anytime once we're open. I'd be happy to give you both a VIP tour. The book again, Blood Washing Blood, Afghanistan's 100-Year War, available now. There it is. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Scott.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.